Hi everyone, and welcome to Truth Over News. Freedom of Information laws, or FOIA laws, have been around for over half a century, but we're now at a point where it seems like every FOIA request from a member of the public becomes a game of cat and mouse between the public and the federal government agencies that are intent on concealing the truth. You may have seen that the Epoch Times was sent 148 pages which were completely blank, and that was in response to a FOIA request for a report on myocarditis in connection with the so-called COVID vaccine. Unfortunately, this kind of incident is no longer unusual. What's the point in even having FOIA laws when all you get are blank pages? The system is in urgent need of reform. Today, we're going to look at some of the most egregious recent abuses and at possible ways that FOIA can be saved. FOIA laws were first contemplated by a California congressman called John Moss. That was in 1955. Moss was concerned that the government had become increasingly secretive during World War II. But there was a lot of opposition from government departments and agencies. No surprises there. It took another 11 years to get the first FOIA bill signed into law. That was in 1966. The law wasn't very effective. It didn't have many guardrails, and it was easily abused by government agencies. And then after the Nixon scandal, there was a push to give FOIA laws some teeth, and real reforms were achieved, including time limits and limited penalties for failure to comply. There have been some minor changes since then, like making the FOIA process more internet-friendly, but on the whole, the law is what it was in 1974. And that is a problem because despite the changes that were made, it's very obvious that 50 years later, the law no longer works. That lesson has been there for everyone to see during both the Russiagate and the COVID sagas, perhaps especially the COVID saga. Instead of functioning as designed to bring transparency to the public, the law has been totally corrupted. Instead of providing information as required by law, federal agencies play games to hide information. They do so by relying on vague concepts of privacy and national security, or by claiming that the matter might be subject to legal proceedings at some point in the future, perhaps, which could mean anything. Some of the abuses are absolutely breathtaking and worth revisiting. Let's start with Russiagate. Tons of FOIA requests were made during Russiagate, but the public hardly ever learned anything from them due to censorship and obstruction. What we did learn, such as the fact that the Steele dossier's main source did not have access to any of the information in the dossier, and in fact disavowed the dossier, well, we only found that out many years after the fact, and not through FOIA, but through Congress, and even then, they still tried to hide all the important details. What about the Peter Strzok and Lisa Page text messages? Well, we only got to see them because the acting Attorney General eventually decided to release them. And they hid the worst ones. Those ones had to be pried out of the hands of the Department of Justice as part of the General Michael Flynn case. One of the most egregious examples from the Russiagate era was the FBI's report on its own interview with Christopher Steele. That report was completely redacted, every single one of its 26 pages. The only reason we eventually got a hold of it is because President Trump, on his last day in office, tried to release a binder full of Russiagate documents. Unfortunately, Chief of Staff Mark Meadows did not actually release the binder, but returned it to the Department of Justice. Luckily, journalist John Solomon somehow got a copy of the FBI's Steele report. As you can see, even the binder version of the interview report is still full of redactions, which only goes to show how completely outrageous it was to redact everything in the first place. But the Department of Justice and the FBI did not care. They thought they could get away with it. And they thought right. Without the lucky circumstance that Solomon got a copy, we would still be in the dark, and the rest of the binder remains hidden to this day. But it's even worse in the case of COVID, where the government has been fighting tooth and nail to redact everything and release nothing. But now and then something slips through the cracks, usually through Congress. And when that happens, it lays bare the corruption and cover-ups being perpetrated by the agencies doing these redactions. That is because documents that eventually slip through the censorship cracks, usually by way of Congress, well, they allow us to compare what we got through the original FOIA process and what the documents really say. Now, in the case of Russiagate and Christopher Steele, the comparison was not that useful because it was just garbage and excuses either way. So getting the less redacted report really made no difference. We already knew the dossier was fabricated, and seeing the interview report did not change that conclusion. But the Fauci emails are a different story, and here is where it gets absolutely nefarious. No beating around the bush, just full-on corruption. Let's look at some before and after examples. There are many to choose from, so we've just selected some of the ones that are particularly corrupt in terms of what was being concealed. Let's start with Peter Daszak, the president of the shady EcoHealth Alliance, through whom Fauci funded the Wuhan lab. There was an internal email among people in Fauci's office from January of 2020. That means before the public was even aware of the threat of the new COVID virus. Here's the email as released under FOIA. You can see that various portions are redacted. Well, the folks over at US Right to Know, that's the transparency group that does so much yeoman's work in getting these kinds of documents, they sued to get a court order that the redactions be removed. Eventually, after many years and a lot of money spent on attorneys, we got the answer. This is what the government was hiding. Using Fauci funds, Daszak and EcoHealth sampled over 10,000 bats, and they discovered 172 new beta coronaviruses, of which 52 were brand new SARS viruses. And they discovered the closest known relative to COVID. All of that information would have been pretty important to know, and none of that information was in any way a state secret. It's data which United States taxpayers paid EcoHealth to obtain, and yet that data was hidden from those taxpayers. Leaving aside the issue of why taxpayers were forced to pay for these reckless experiments in the first place, the data belongs to the taxpayers who paid for it. But Fauci and the NIH did not want to share the info because it was damaging and would have led to many questions. Where are all these new viruses? What did the Wuhan lab do with them? Why did the Wuhan lab delete its database if it contained data paid for by US taxpayers? We could go on, but you get the point. Now, our next example is perhaps even worse. It's from April of 2020 and also involves Daszak. Here's the before image. Again, a bunch of stuff was concealed. It took Senator Ron Johnson to force the NIH to reveal what that email said. The work we've been doing in collaboration with Chinese virologists, that means the Wuhan lab, has given us incredible insight into the risks that these viruses represent. Well, it looks like the NIH did not want the public, who paid for all these experiments, to know about those risks, or about the Wuhan lab playing around with these risky viruses. Again, there's no justification for these redactions. Daszak was simply stating that he was using US taxpayer money to conduct these experiments and collect this data. Next up, we have Fauci himself. Here's the before image. Fauci's email only has one line of text, and it was fully redacted other than 2 question marks at the front. The email was of great interest to people like us, precisely because of those 2 question marks. And because of the 3 people on the email, Fauci, his boss, Francis Collins, and British Pharmaceutical Trust Director, Jeremy Farah. Those were the instigators of the phony proximal origin paper, the paper that was used by Fauci to shut down any lab leak discussion. Well, it took a lot of pressure from Congress to finally figure out what Fauci had said after those question marks. And even then, we only found out because a congressional staffer was eventually allowed to look at the email briefly in a secure room, and he or she scribbled down what it said. Serial passage in ACE2 transgenic mice. Now, that's a smoking gun, and here's why. COVID came out of the box ready to infect humans, which does not happen with natural viruses which need time to adapt. The way you achieve ready to infect humans status is to serial passage the virus in ACE2 transgenic mice in a lab. So in other words, Fauci knew exactly what had happened. In fact, it appears as if the proximal origin authors had originally used this phrase in an early draft, and Fauci was not happy with that. And what do you know? The word mice does not appear in the final version, nor the word transgenic. So NIH censors helped Fauci cover up the fact that he knew how the virus was made and that he stealth edited, we should say, the proximal origin paper. Next up, we probably have the most well-known and also the worst example of NIH censors covering up for Fauci. Right after Fauci had organized a secret teleconference to start the cover-up of COVID's origin, he emailed a few top dogs at NIH and at the Health and Human Services Department about what had been discussed. Here's the before image. Every last word was redacted. Again, through pressure from Congress, we eventually got to know what Fauci said, and here it is. There were mutations in the virus that would be most unusual to have evolved naturally in the bats, and that there was a suspicion that this mutation was intentionally inserted. The suspicion was heightened by the fact that scientists in Wuhan University are known to have been working on gain-of-function experiments to determine the molecular mechanisms associated with bat viruses adopting to human infection, and the outbreak originated in Wuhan. Well, what do you know? Again, Fauci knew. And again, the exact opposite was being said in private to what was being said in public. The only reason this email was redacted was to hide the truth. Here's another really bad one. This one involves Bob, who is Robert Gary, one of the proximal origin authors who had been recruited by Fauci. In Proximal Origin, Gary claims that COVID is totally natural and there's no evidence whatsoever of a lab origin. Well, thanks to congressional pressure, we finally found out what he was saying in private. After describing COVID's very peculiar insert, the one that creates the furin cleavage site, which makes COVID so virulent and which has never been seen in any natural SARS virus, Gary concluded, "I just can't figure out how this gets accomplished in nature." Again, there's only one reason this was redacted, and that is to conceal the truth about the virus's origin. So what is the legal standard that is being invoked by the censors? In almost every case, the standard they use is the B5 exemption. It's defined as the deliberative process privilege, with agencies like the NIH claiming that their internal discussions are legally privileged. But what does that even mean? Well, it can mean anything to anyone, which is why in FOIA parlance, B5 is jokingly referred to as withhold it because you want to. B5 is invoked whenever an agency wants to avoid disclosing embarrassing or incriminating documents, which is exactly what we just saw in example after example. So, is the solution as simple as getting rid of B5? Unfortunately not. Not all redactions rely on B5. The first example we looked at used a similarly fuzzy standard of potential law enforcement, meaning that maybe one day there might be a legal case, so we can't disclose the information. That is the B7 exemption. So if we get rid of B5, agencies will just use B7. That said, tightening these exemptions is absolutely a first step and a necessary step. The only allowable redactions should be for personal information and genuine government secrets, say like military plans, and so on. But there are other problems, and those are the bad apples. Take David Morins, for instance. He's one of the highest-ranking NIH officials, and he blatantly used Gmail to avoid FOIA laws, and then he bragged about it to the Proximal Origin authors and also to Peter Daszak. And he's probably not the only one who does this. It doesn't matter how tight B5 and B7 are or how good the reforms are if people just go ahead and use Gmail. Another flaw is internal pressure. We saw from some of the COVID FOIAs that Francis Collins, who at the time was the head of the NIH with its $60 billion budget and 20,000 staff, well, Francis Collins somehow had enough time to personally review FOIA responses before they were sent out. Many of those FOIAs related directly to Collins' own conduct, such as the hidden email about the ACE2 transgenic mice used to make COVID. Not only is that completely beyond the pale and a massive conflict of interest, but it also places huge pressure on lower-level FOIA staff to conceal everything so as not to upset the big boss. Again, this is totally incompatible with the principles of FOIA. The public pays for everything, and they have a right to know what is being done with their money. The Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs is currently looking into the issue of FOIA reform. Let's hope they do something. But the most important remedy isn't even legislative. Any legal rule can be bent if the bureaucrats in charge are hell-bent on bending it. Ultimately, there won't be real transparency until the totally bloated federal bureaucracy is drained and all the bad apples are gone. Thanks for joining us in today's episode of Truth Over News.